AI guys who had some really, really interesting ideas about how the brain might work. And you had also neuroscientists who had a completely different way of looking at the problem, but complementary, and yet they weren't looking at each other's work at all.
That's right.
I guess the real challenge becomes, how do you bring the contemplatives and the people who really made progress in contemplative practice together with some of the people who are doing really fascinating things with science and technology?
Yes. That seems to be the emerging thing right now. Like the Mind and Life Institute, you know, which started a couple decades ago, has been doing a ton with respect to that. And I've met a lot of the contemplative scientists who've sort of been brought up in that conversation, and they have a completely different way of orienting toward these things because they both have been practicing seriously for a decade or two now, and they're trained in their specialty fields, and they're talking to each other. So I'm personally really excited about that development. And then the next step beyond research seems to be then application. How do you take research and apply it in a way that actually reaches out and touches the average person? That seems to be maybe the next wave. And I think you're right that the issue is, how do you get these people talking so that you don't miss out on a really important piece of the puzzle? And it seems like those conversations are just starting to happen through things like Wisdom 2 or through the Buddhist Geeks conference that we're put on. Like those conversations privately, they've been happening. That's exciting to me. That's really exciting.
Yeah, no, I agree. The thing about conferences generally is that it's always a different group of people who show up, and perhaps to go deep, we need much more space and time to come together. So, for example, you have the Dalai Lama has this thing, I think it's sometimes through Mind Life, but it's gone on for years, where you bring together scientists and traditional Buddhist scholars. And they're there for a week or 10 days, but they spend the whole time just getting their vocabularies to match. Everything has to be translated from English, Tibetan, and back and forth, right? And you know, like Westerners don't have, generally Western science hasn't spent a lot of time defining what awareness is or what mind is, and the Tibetans have spent centuries, you know, working that one out, right? So I think that still is a very real issue that has to be negotiated.
Yeah, and that's why I get excited about these sort of hybrid specialists who are taking at least two fields, like contemplation and science or neuroscience, for instance, and they're really training deeply in both. Like they're spending a significant amount of time in both. We wouldn't say they're like the old Tibetan, you know, yogis who went in the caves for 50 years, but they do understand enough that they started to make connections for themselves. And I see what you're saying. Like a conference is enough to kind of bring people together and connect people, which is useful, but it's not enough to do serious projects or make serious headway on some of the bigger issues. And for me, I think a lot of it's going to happen through business. Actually, will be one of the drivers. Getting people together to work on commercial projects or nonprofit projects where you have to bring those kind of teams together. My friend Rohan Gunatilaka, who I'm a collaborator with, he wrote a post recently on the Buddhist News Channel about the usefulness of having chief dharma officers, you know, in companies, people that are holding down that kind of perspective when the company is operating in that field. And I think that type of thinking is right on. Although there'll be a question as to how much the chief dharma officers get paid.
In traditional Buddhism, such as Tibet, you would become a teacher. You go through so many years of retreat, or you get a Kempo or Geshe degree, and it's recognized, and at least there's you know, some kind of support for that. And I do think it's an issue of how do we support homegrown contemplatives. Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's a huge question. Like Alan Wallace, when I interviewed him, he talked about contemplative science as a possible field or a way that people could legitimize contemplative practice, like serious contemplative practice. And that seems to be happening a little bit more. Like the people I mentioned, they part of their job is actually to go on retreats and do this stuff.
Right.
Then the other is sort of I would say more the hippie model, which is, you live incredibly simply, and you devote your life to going and practicing and doing, 3-year retreats and long retreats. And, you basically don't develop the other areas of your life, and you focus as a specialist on that. And it's really difficult financially, and I see a lot of people now who are trying to retire who did that are having trouble financially, even really well-known people.
Right.
And then the other thing, which is sort of where I've been putting a lot of my interest in, is how do you optimize the process so that there isn't this massive barrier to entry? Like using technology as an aid, how do you optimize the awakening process, basically, so that it becomes more readily accessible to people without having to put as much, so quality over quantity. Instead of doing the brute force method of like spending 20 years on retreat, could we help develop things that, bring some of those benefits quicker for more people? Which is, some people that have spent 20 years on retreat don't want to hear that. And they probably have good points, probably good points that need to be heard.